Vivian Oberling. I am so excited to have you here. We have been friends for 20 years.
Yep.
But for everybody who doesn't yet know you, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I am a clinical psychologist and hold a lot of different roles. I hold traditional roles like doing therapy with adults, kids, adolescents, families, and couples, so kind of the whole range of everyone under the sun at this point. And then I also work with startups like Hello Prenup in creating content, as well as advising companies like Love Every. I'm on their disability council, so helping give information from psychology and research to really make sure that their products are doing good in the world. Outside of that, I live in Arizona with my husband and 2 kids who love and adore you. They're Auntie Julia. But yeah.
I love them. So you produce all of our psychology-related content, how couples should communicate, how they should talk about a prenup. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about how someone should approach a prenup.
That's a good question. I think what's really interesting and what's great is that more and more people are actually even thinking about approaching a prenup. And so this, I think, is a really good and timely question. The thing I would tell couples before they started this conversation is take a beat, think about how you actually feel about a prenup. You can't have a good conversation if you don't know where you're coming from. So think about the things that you would want from it. Think about the biases you have about it. When you hear prenup, like what do you imagine right off the bat? Is it, oh, like I have no money, so this is a great thing for me? Is it a stereotype of, rich husband, poor wife? What comes to mind? And the reason that's important is because it's going to give you a sense of what are my assumptions and what are my values? What do I really want to get out of this process? And that, I think, is a key to having that conversation, because if you're approaching it in that way, you and your partner can really hear what's beneath kind of the content. So what are you both getting out of this? What are you asking each other for? Versus getting stuck on the wording of the exact contract or the amount of money, but just this is what we want to do for each other and protect each other.
Okay, so say I want to bring up this prenup.
Yes.
And I'm really nervous that my boo is going to be upset, feel offended.
Uh-huh.
How and when do I bring this topic up?
Okay. So one thing I will say is do not bring it up out of the blue or in a crowded area, right? Like if you're at dinner, don't just all of a sudden drop like, hey, so I think we should get a prenup and I've already started the process, right? Not a good thing.
Okay.
As much as possible, give each other time to prepare.
Okay.
So let your partner know, hey, this is what I'm thinking about. I want us to explore the process together and let's talk about it on Saturday. Like, let's get lunch at home and kind of go through this together. The other thing I would say also is if you know that your partner might have a big reaction, like you know your partner well, the truth about each other, what each other gets triggered off of, practice it. And most of my clients get really like, oh, but it's fine. I don't need to practice it, right? It's actually really useful. Would you go into a job interview or certain things without practicing? Probably not. Whether it's jotting down notes, whether it's recording yourself, kind of talking about it, right?
One.
Or if you have a trusted friend, do a little role play. If your friend knows your partner, tell them, hey, can you act like my partner?
Yeah.
You know what they get upset about, you know how they might respond, or the questions they ask. Try it out and hear from your friend like, ooh, yeah, when you said this part, I felt almost upset about it. And it gives you ways to practice before you actually bring it up with your partner.
These are great tips.
Yeah.
So let's back it up. Let's pretend that I am just single and ready to mingle, and I'm out on the scene.
Mm-hmm.
What should I be looking for or doing to make sure that I am dating the right partner?
That is a good question. I wish I could tell myself this many, many years ago. And like,
Me too.
I don't even know how you knew my dating history, how many like hundreds of, they're funny now, dating stories, but back then they weren't so great.
Feel free to tell any of those stories today.
Oh no, I actually did find quite a screenshots of text messages that I was like, wow, these probably should actually be shared. But what I would say is today when you're thinking about partners, and I think there's a component too of as people wait a little longer to think about who do I want to be in a committed relationship with, whether that's a marriage or not, they're coming in with a lot more things of their own life.
Yeah.
So in thinking about how do I want to proceed with someone and integrate my life with them is a really important question. And it's not only things like, well, where do we live or our careers, but thinking ahead and having those conversations on what are our values and do those align? How do we want to support each other? How do we want to communicate? Do you tend to be a person that when there's conflict, you shy away and you need a day to process? And I tend to be a person that needs to talk about it right away or else I get really anxious. Knowing yourself and knowing how that interacts with your partner's style is really important because those things don't tend to change or can't change until you're like working on it together.
What about for women? What should women be looking for in a relationship? Because I think I'm coming at this question from a place of so many women tend to compromise, I think, what they really want for whatever it is that their partner is interested in or excited about. And I think this manifests itself oftentimes in the prenup conversation, which is why historically women have felt a little bit hesitant to enter into a prenup. But I think it goes back. It goes back into the idea of, how do women really hone in on what's important for them and what's in their best interest in a relationship?
I think that's a good question. And I think, surprisingly, the answer I'll give is not only focused on women. I think this could be for any individual. But there's a part of it that I think is more specific to a woman and just historically a role that they have played in a relationship. The first part is going back to values, understanding, okay, what's truly important for me and where are the places that I'm not going to compromise. I don't want to compromise and I shouldn't. And I think that's really important because most of us don't take the time to actually think about, well, what are my core values? Is it family? Is it honesty? Is it adventure, compassion? Like there's this great thing, you can actually Google it. It's just called value card sort.
Oh.
And they give you like 100 values, which most of the time you're like, I didn't even know these were values. And you literally sort them into very important, kind of important, not important to me. And you get a good sense of like, okay, this is where my values lie at this time. That's important because if you have a clear understanding of that, you know where you're not going to compromise or where you can compromise. And with that clarity, you can be really clear with your partner of like, hey, this is where I'm at. These are my hard no's. Can you deal with that? Or is this not something I want to invest the time in before I get in too deep? I think a lot of times these conversations end up happening if, couples are lucky, like right before marriage or a little after. And even at that point, right, it's hard to make changes. Or if they're happening after, right, things pile up and like, well, we've invested time in each other. We have kids, we have a house, mortgage, whatever it may be.
And then you avoid it. You avoid the conversation because you're afraid of the answer. I know we've all been there.
Or you put Band-Aids on it, right? Like, okay, I think this is good enough. And you start making small concessions that avalanche into something bigger. That at that point, it feels hard to be able to attack. Like there's no good way to do it because it's gotten so big. And I think for women, it's also practicing being able to make requests of like, this is what I need, as well as learning to say no. And again, this could be for anybody who, if you feel like it's harder to say no or to step away from something, to remember you always have a choice. And there are times when, I think this is one of the hardest things actually that comes up for clients in therapy, is everything is a choice. Whether or not it's a fair choice, whether or not that should even be a choice is true. But you make a choice of whether or not you want to step into a relationship that's going to fulfill your needs. Or if you want to step out of it and say, no, that's not actually going to provide me with what I want, and I know there's a loss. And I think the earlier that you can do that, especially as a woman, gives you a better foundation. And also is very clear with your partner on like, hey, this is where I stand. And it doesn't feel like you got pushed down and then later on you have to try even harder to be like, no, this isn't what I want. And it's not heard.
And another taboo topic among couples, once you're in that relationship, is money.
Yes.
And I think it's really tough for couples to talk about money before they absolutely have to. Do you have any tips on that? Or I guess, like, let's back it up. Why should couples talk about money at all before they're living together and they absolutely have to, or getting married and planning a wedding and absolutely have to?
So I will preface this with, it's easy for me to say this, and I will also take full, accountability in my own personal life. It's still very hard to talk about. But I think one thing that's uniquely from a perspective of a psychologist is, sorry, you're going to hear this again, is like a value-based approach. So what does money mean to you? Almost always, money means something else to you and every person than just a dollar amount. It usually means
so true.
Security. It could mean status. It could mean confidence. It could mean so many different things. And each person puts a different meaning to it. And a lot of that has to do with how you grew up, how money was talked about, how it played a role in your life, whether it was plentiful or not, right? And so all of those things, because it's connected to all of that, money is not just like, oh, okay, you're paying $50, I'm paying $50.
Yeah.
It's a lot more. And if you don't create the room for that, if you don't actually validate, like, yeah, it means something else, it becomes this thing you don't want to talk about. It becomes too big, right? So if you can figure out what money actually means to you and share that with your partner, it makes it a lot easier. And then you both understand where each other's coming from. You understand, and you also understand, like, oh, that's why my partner's getting so upset about it. It's not because I forgot to give him the $10 back, but for them, right, that's following through with my promises. So it's not always about the dollar amount. And if you can think about it and talk about it in that way, then it feels, I think, a lot easier to attack and bring up. And then the more you do it, the more you definitely will become more comfortable.
Should couples go to counseling before they ever get engaged or married? Like, is there any benefit to having a structured place to talk about these really tough topics before you're married?
I mean, I'm always going to say yes in my profession, but I will actually say this. I don't believe that therapy is useful for everyone at every point in their life.
Okay.
I will never be like, yes, no matter what, you need therapy. I actually think that if you are not fully invested in therapy, if you don't find the right match, it actually can do harm to you or your partnership. That being said, I am also, though, a big fan of don't wait till something's gotten huge. Say you're at like the brink of getting a divorce, bring up, to then jump into therapy, because it's going to be so much work and it may not be helpful at that point. You kind of want to start early on as preventative care. The big thing that's really useful is that you will have a neutral source, right? Who's able to, I think a lot of things that bring people in for therapy is, I'm saying something and my partner can't hear it. The partner is saying, like, I'm hearing it, but they're not hearing what I'm saying back.
Yeah.
You have almost this translator to slow things down, to be able to say without any skin in the game. This is what I'm hearing from so-and-so. You know, how do you feel about that? Here's what I'm hearing here. And to be able to provide a lot of strategies on your situation and your partnership. What are things that might make this easier? How do I practice this at home?
Yeah.
And break down something that often feels really big into doable pieces that you can start to learn and build skills on your own, so that at some point you don't need a therapist.
Yeah.
And you have that trusted source to come back to if you need it, but it isn't something that you need to do forever once you start.
Oftentimes when people are in a relationship, serious relationship, and getting married, planning a wedding, they lose themselves and everything becomes about the couple and they're doing everything together. What advice do you have for couples who feel like they're in that position and want to preserve that individuality?
So it's actually interesting. I just read an article about this that actually found that when couples support their partner's autonomy in a relationship, they actually have a higher satisfaction with their relationship. And I think that's just pointing to the fact that you can be together, you can be a unit, and still maintain your individuality. And I think that more and more couples are coming to that, I don't want to say crisis, but it's a challenge, right?
Yeah.
It's something that is coming up more because as couples get together a little later in life, married or not, they have more of their life that they're bringing to the table.
Yeah.
Than when the average marriage was happening around the 20s, right? Like you're
Yeah.
still growing up, you're still
I think the average age of
babies.
marriage is now 30.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And you have so much more, right, that you've lived,
Yeah.
that you've learned about yourself. And I think that the first thing is to validate it's okay that you still want to be yourself and now a husband, wife, partner. And to be able to kind of think about, well, what do I want to make sure I don't lose about myself?
Yeah.
Like personally, I have always been a big traveler, and you know this. I love my girls trip.
Yes.
And that was something that was a non-negotiable
Yeah.
with me and Michael. Was like, I want to be able to see my friends, and he's
Yeah.
always been like, yeah, you want to have your girl trip? Like,
Yeah.
great. Like, I'll
we
see
have
you
tons
next
of
week.
girls trips. Yeah, for two women who have
Yes.
kids,
We see each other
we
quite
still
often.
we still do girls trips.
I know.
Yeah.
But that was something really important to me, to be able to just be the best person I could be,
Yeah.
to then be a good partner. And I think that's, that's said about parenthood too, is like,
Yeah.
if you take care of yourself, then you will be a better parent to your child because you're being the best person you can be.
Yeah.
I think it's very much the same thing for partners. If you're not taking care of yourself, how can you be a good partner? How can you be a good support system
Yeah.
for another person if you can't do it for yourself? And I think that in the wedding and thinking about that, thinking about what makes each person a unique person and incorporating that into your wedding so you're also celebrating it too. So if, someone's a musician, like put those little aspects of that into the wedding. If someone's an artist, maybe like showcase their artwork, whatever it
Cute.
is.
That's a great idea.
And I'm thinking of all these people that have like all these big skills. I do not have any of those skills, but I loved,
You did
desserts.
have donuts.
Exactly.
You did have donuts at your wedding.
And so like that, like little things like that where, it's not like, oh, the couple loves donuts. It's, hey, yeah, the groom loves donuts, and that's something that everyone that knows him knows that's his favorite thing.
Yeah.
You get to showcase those parts of each other as you're building a new life together.
Yeah, that's great advice. Social media plays into relationships in such a
Yes.
big way. I think from start to finish, right? There's always that beginning question of like, when do I post my new guy, gal on my social and make it official? And then all the way to I'm planning this wedding and I want it to be Pinterest perfect. And I think that actually, we have kids now, and I think that even carries into having kids and like kind of posting this perfect image on social media. So how can couples work through that? How can they manage the social media kind of intensity and pressures with everyday life, and how do you think that it affects relationships?
That's a totally easy question. I totally have all the answers
There's
to
just
that.
5 parts to that question.
Yeah, I'll just solve all of social media.
Yes.
As everyone in the world works on that.
Yep.
It's, I think it is, there's an individual aspect to it of understanding for yourself, okay, how do I interact with social media and how does it make me feel? There is a lot of overexposure, I think, in people's lives on social media. And it doesn't always, social media is very much a tool. I'm coming from it with the true belief that it can be a good or bad thing depending on how you use it and how you pay attention to the warning signs. In a partnership, I think there's very much a need for honest conversation about how each of you utilize it and how it's impacting your relationship. How does the other person feel about it? And an example I'll give is if you have a couple who one person is very active on social media, has always been, right? Loves to share their life, whatever it may be, and you have another person who tends to be very private, who really uses social media to keep in contact with close friends, doesn't really post, but like looks at family pictures, those sorts of things. If you know that, then it is a give and take on moving forward what's going to be the best for your relationship.
Yeah.
It's not only the person who tends to post a lot, maybe checking in with like, hey, how do you feel about me posting like our pictures on our honeymoon? But it's also thinking about the other person making requests, right? Your partner's not a mind reader. They don't know what you're going to feel comfortable or not comfortable with. So if you know your partner tends to post a lot, preempting that and being like, hey, can we save our honeymoon? Actually, this is really special to me. It's our time to just like decompress and be with each other. I don't really want that on social media. Can we agree not to post that? And then to have a conversation, to be open back and forth about what is it that you guys are agreeing to and how do you want to use it moving forward. I will add, there's always that question about fidelity and social media.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yes. And I'm not gonna lie, that is a big thing, right? It does make it easier for you to meet people. It does make it easier to see a certain ideal and imagine, right, being with someone else. It's also easy to get sucked down that rabbit hole of like, so-and-so liked this picture, why are you friends with this person, etc. And again, I think it's very much individualized of what do you feel comfortable with and what are you asking your partner to do or not do, and coming to an agreement on that. And the biggest thing is it shouldn't be a surprise. It should not be a surprise to either side of what the person feels comfortable with and what their partner is asking them to do. Because if it is a surprise and there is anger and all these feelings behind it, then you're already late in the game. This should have been something that was talked about hopefully earlier on. And it's a continual conversation. I hate to say it. It's not a one and done. It's a let's check in because social media changes and grows.
Yeah.
So you've got to keep having this conversation.
And I feel like, too, there's always, even if it's not about, like, infidelity or, that kind of social media, I think there's always a conflict between couples these days. I mean, at least I feel this way in our friend groups, like, how much you're actually using social media. Like, I hear so much. My partner is just sitting there on the couch, scrolling for hours on end, and I feel like we don't interact. How do you suggest couples handle that?
That is a good question. Michael's probably going to kill me for saying this, but there are definitely times like he's like watching, a video game or whatever, and I'm like, get off your phone. And he's like, you're literally on your phone too. And it's like, well, okay.
But
true.
It's different.
Shoot, I didn't even realize I was doing that. I think there needs to be action on it, right? Like, it is really easy to get sucked into it.
Yeah.
It's easy to use social media and our phones as a coping strategy, right? You have a stressful day at work. I just like want to do something a little mindless, right? Next thing you know, it's been 2 hours. But the thing I would say is start off small. We're not going to be turning off our phones, right? Like, you get grand plans of like, we're going to go phoneless for a whole day. Like,
it's
we're going
hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
It's really hard. So maybe start off small with, hey, before we do our things, when we come home, let's have 10 minutes to catch up with each other. Ask each other how our days were. Or schedule another time maybe before bed where we're putting away our phones, we're charging it across the room so we're not touching it so we can actually catch up with each other. Whatever it is, putting it out on the table and making it actionable is really helpful, because then you're both doing it at the same time versus expecting each other to, well, I'm off my phone right now, you should be too.
Right. We're not mind readers.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe they're stressed and I'm okay right now, and that flip-flops. But just finding a time to be with each other and put those things away is really helpful. And also just sharing like how it feels when, you know, you're talking and your partner's on the phone.
Yeah.
Or vice versa. Sharing how that impacts you is actually really beneficial, because hearing like, wow, I feel ignored when you do that to me is more motivating than, hey, get off your phone, right? It's sharing how it makes you feel. Your partner's not going to make you feel that way. So they're going to be much more motivated to make a change than it feeling like they're being blamed or shamed for their behaviors.
Well, since we're hitting all of the kind of hot button topics here, let's talk about in-laws, shall we?
Okay.
So if you are married, it's likely you feel a certain way about your in-laws. Let's say that certain way isn't the most positive. How should someone handle that? Or how should a couple handle that? Because really they should be handling it together, right?
Yes. I think that's a great question. And this is something that has been around since the beginning of time, right? There's all these memes, stories about a monster-in-law, all of that. So
great movie.
It was a really great movie. I miss J-Lo in that movie, Jane Fonda. It's not something that's new, and yet it's still very pervasive. And I think it's something that as you start life together, you realize how much of your family, in whatever capacity they are part of your life, impacts the way you are. And there is a period of learning to be a different person with your partner than being a son, daughter, whatever it was.
So true.
You also, when you get married, you don't just marry the other person. You're marrying their families, their friends, all of that.
Yep.
Right? So do not wait until after it's said and done to bring these all up. Share in it and tell your partner how you're feeling as well as what you're hoping to make changes on. And going from there, it's going to be very different for each partner and each family, right? For some families, it may be I'm sharing it to my partner and my partner's actually going to be talking to his parents, because hearing it from me is not going to be the best setup.
Yep.
Sometimes it might be directly from me.
Yep.
But I think the first step is always having an honest conversation with your partner, and also being receptive to being curious about why your partner's feeling that way. It's really easy to feel defensive of, no, that's like my mom and dad. Like, you can't talk smack about them. They raised me. They did all this stuff for me. That all can be true, and maybe they are like encroaching on your guys' space. Maybe they need to call before just dropping by. So it is a give and take as you're creating your own family.
Yeah.
And I think you have to take into account on your partner's end, what are they really asking for, and how can you guys both come to an agreement? And knowing that it may not be forever, right?
Yeah.
It may be after you're married, you do need to prioritize this little family for, say, the first year or two. It doesn't have to be that way forever. But if that's going to strengthen your relationship, then it's really important.
And a time when this comes up a lot is wedding planning.
Yes.
So the in-laws getting very involved in the wedding planning.
Yeah.
I always tell this story about a prenup that I worked on where the in-laws were actually paying for the entire wedding. And thus were not only dictating every detail about the wedding, but they were kind of using it as a control mechanism in the relationship a little bit, like trying to dictate where the couple would live because they would be buying that house for the couple. And I think this is something, a lot of couples really struggle with. So if that's the case, which is extreme, but there are varying forms of that extreme, how should couples handle that?
I mean, not to make a side note, but like as you were telling that, I really thought you were going to tell me like another horror story, which I have heard often, which is, I'm sorry to put like the mother-in-law stereotype here, but like mother-in-laws wearing white dresses to the wedding.
Totally.
And all of that. But
totally. I mean, like I've heard of this happening. Like, oh my God, my mother-in-law wore a white dress to my rehearsal dinner. Like, what the heck?
So there are varying degrees of like how I would approach this, but this may sound a little surprising. One of the things I would say is in situations like that, things can't be done to you without your permission.
Okay.
Whether you are explicitly or implicitly allowing it to happen, if that is a situation, something in your behavior and your partner is allowing this to continue where your in-laws or your parents feel like they can tell you what to do because they are providing you something in return. If that is not what you want, the only way to stop that is to make a change. Whether that is not taking the money, if that's saying, no, okay, I won't have my dream wedding because I don't want to have a color palette of blush and cream. Like, I want something different. It's recognizing, okay, where do I have power in this and where can I make a change?
But if they're giving you the money, like let's say your in-laws are giving you a chunk of money for your wedding, which I think is fairly common.
Yeah.
How, like, is there a way, practically speaking, is there a way for you to say, I accept your money, but like not your control?
Yes, so there definitely is. And I think it's the preparation of knowing that they may then say, then no, we won't be giving you this money.
Okay.
And it's just having that clarity of like, okay, where are my boundaries in what I will accept for whatever this exchange is? And where am I saying, no, I don't want that?
Okay.
And it's not going to be an easy decision, right? That's where the conversation with partners is really important because I can guarantee that won't be the end of the conversation. It'll be like, well, my parents are going to feel hurt.
Ooh.
Like this money is their way of saying they love us, right? We're rejecting their love. So you have to really flesh out, okay, what does this all mean?
Yeah.
And then with that, how are we going to approach together that parent, whoever it is that might be providing something? And I think the key there is it has to be a united front. Because if it's not feeling united, then it's going to fester underneath. If it feels like, well, we made this decision together and then it was told like, well, so-and-so didn't really want to do this, but I said we should have, right? It's not going to be a good start to the partnership if that trust isn't there. And so if you guys disagree, whatever it is, hash it out and provide a united front when you do make a decision.
And have the conversation together with the parents? Is that the goal?
So this is where therapy is good because all of these little nuances are what you would work out with a therapist because there's so much that goes into it of like, well, what are your parents like? What is the relationship with in-laws and kiddos, right? Like all of that. I would say it's very much dependent on the couple and the parents. If you can do it together, it feels good because then it feels united. But I don't think that always has to be the case.
So back to prenups, because
Yep.
it always comes back to prenups. About 10 to 15 years ago, there was a Harvard study that said only about 5% of all marriages had a prenup. About 3 years ago, there was a New Yorker article that said that about 15% of all marriages had a prenup. Recently, there was a Harris poll that came out that said about 40% of millennials and Gen Zs who are married or engaged have a prenup. Why have prenups become so popular?
I mean, I think you have a lot more information and data than I would on
Psychologically,
that.
why have prenups become more acceptable? I know I have
I know.
my thoughts and feelings on this, but I'm not a psychologist.
I think there's a lot of different reasons, but one is definitely that mental health in general is much more acceptable as a topic of discussion with younger and younger generations. It's not something that's hidden, right? Talked about in code, like, I'm going to go see someone for something, right? It's like, oh no, I have a therapy appointment today. Like, let's meet for lunch afterwards.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And it's such a great thing. But I think with that, there's also this focus on mental health in couples, how important that is to be able to talk to each other honestly, openly, to think about feelings as well as financial and, well, you know, when I'm in work mode, I'm like operational is like operation of a relationship and a household. But because of that, I think there's been an openness to then talk about other hard topics that in the past were often, I think, brushed under the rug. And prenup is one of them. And with people also committing at an older age, and I said older, not old, older.
30 is not old, just to clarify.
Yes. But you're coming in with a lot more life, property, assets. Maybe you've been married before. Maybe you have kiddos from a past marriage. All these things that you need to consider and talk about with your partner before you enter into a legal agreement. And I think that that's something also important to talk about because, yes, a marriage is a time of happiness, of integrating your life with someone else, but it's also a financial agreement and commitment to each other. And that's something that shouldn't be, you know, hidden or not talked about. Talking about it early on is really important. I think because of that, the openness to prenups is much higher. And I think that with companies like Hello Prenup, where it's also easier to do, it feels more accessible, and it's something that couples are at least open to exploring. And usually once you explore it, you see the benefits of it. So it's kind of an easy, like, okay, well, then let's, you know, put this down in writing.
Thank you so much for being here today. Where can people go to learn a little bit more about you?
Well, luckily, all the things we talked about today, they can find information about that on Hello Prenup's blog. And the best thing about all these articles is I've linked a lot of things we've talked about so people can learn more about it, the research behind it, tools that are really useful for couples as they're having all these, you know, hard conversations. Outside of that, they can also find me on my LinkedIn. It's just my name on LinkedIn if people want to learn more or reach out and have more conversations.
I love it. Thank you again for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.